Have you ever had one of those periods in your life where everything fell apart all at once? For me, it happened in the winter of 1988. Right after New Year, I found out my boyfriend was cheating on me. A week after that, I lost my job. And then a few days before my birthday in February, my grandfather died. Since I was no longer gainfully employed, it was expected that I leave for home at once. Well, I was fine with that, except that the absence of employment also meant the absence of income. I didn't have the money to pay for the plane ticket, and there were no trains that could take me from St. Louis to nowhere. The thought of riding a bus for 16 hours when a car ride would take 6 was also more than a little stomach churning. Unfortunately, that meant driving my 1977 International Scout II all the way home in January with a massive blizzard building out west that was threatening to dump a foot of snow all over the roads I'd be traveling. I loved that old Scout. It was ugly as hell and about as reliable as gas station sushi, but it was mine. I bought it secondhand when I was 16 and newly licensed. It carried my belongings from Willard Springs to St. Louis when I moved there out of high school. And to be fair, I had to stop in Fort Madison, Iowa for repairs. And then I got all the way to Hannibal, Missouri before another mechanic was required. It didn't help that I'd chosen to follow the river all the way down. It added extra miles and undue wear and tear on the old girl. But somehow, the Scout and I made it. Of course, that was the middle of summer, and now 5 years and a lot more miles later, I would be making the return trip in a possible snowstorm. I got the call about Granddaddy Friday afternoon. The funeral was planned for Monday the 1st, my birthday. I didn't argue or complain. If a man died on Friday, he was buried on Monday. 3 days. That was the rule back then. The only option was to go home. With one bag of clothes and a small toiletry case, I headed for Willard Springs. It really is in the middle of nowhere. It's the kind of town where you grow up but you don't stay. Those who do stay either own farms or live off food stamps and government rations, or they serve. The serving options range from food to gasoline. I didn't see myself as one of those people. My grades weren't good enough to pursue a degree, but I wasn't about to waste my life fighting off drunken advances at Dooley's Corner Tap, handing out greasy plates of food at Fat Mattie's Catfish Cafe, or stocking cigarettes behind the counter at the corner gas. It's the life I got anyway, albeit in a different location. But I did accomplish one thing. After 5 years of school, I had an associate degree. And at that rate, I fully expected to have my bachelor a year or so before I retired. It was mid-afternoon when I left for home. How I managed to arrive is beyond me. A 400-mile road trip with Scout is not my idea of pleasure. She grumbled and belched ugly black smoke and hissed menacingly from under the hood the whole trip. Twice I pulled over to eat just so she could have a rest. Each time I turned off the ignition, I was sure she would never start again, but I couldn't make myself push the old girl any harder than was necessary. I paid her for her efforts with gasoline, motor oil, antifreeze, and all of which she had a gluttonous appetite for. It must have been nearly 10 o'clock when I pulled into the barnyard where I grew up. There was a light on in the kitchen, but the rest of the house was dark. I guessed that Mom and Dad had left the light on for me. They would have been in bed 2 hours earlier. Well, I didn't mind. They were already old when they had me. I was a menopause baby, and my other siblings were all grown or nearly so when I came along. Old people tend to go to bed early and rise with the sun. Old farmers get up early and eat breakfast and feed the animals and milk and gather eggs and work on whichever piece of equipment happens to be broken at the moment, and then, when the sun finally decides to get up, they shake their fists at it for being lazy, and then they start their day. I turned off the engine and stuck my keys into my jeans pocket and patted the dashboard and thanked Scout for getting me there. And I grabbed my bags and I went inside. There was a note on the table from Mom telling me there was a plate of food in the fridge for me and that she and Dad would see me in the morning. I set the plate of meatloaf, potatoes, and creamed corn on the table, and I rooted around until I found a bottle of root beer. It was the first quiet moment I'd had since the phone rang that morning. Between figuring out how much money I could afford to spend and what clothes I needed to bring and worrying about Scout's ability to get me there, I hadn't let myself think about my grandfather. My mother's father was the reason everyone called me Shadow. From the moment I was old enough to walk, where he went, I went. His house was across a wide gravel road from ours, so he walked over and had breakfast with us most mornings. When he left, unless I had to go to school, I went with him. And the adventures we had together were worth a lifetime of memories. We'd go down to the river to scout for good fishing spots, or we'd wander around out in the woods checking for signs of deer and turkey. He bought me my first fishing pole and my first BB gun. He taught me to drive as soon as my legs were long enough to reach the pedals. Most farm kids learn that skill early, but it was my grandfather who taught me. He'd taken me into town for coffee at Fat Mattie's or for a strawberry soda at the county creamery. And if he got up to leave and I didn't immediately get up to follow, he'd turn and say, "Come on, Shadow," and the name stuck. When I moved to St. Louis, he was the one that I called every night. He always seemed to know when I needed money, and things would get tight, and I'd open my mailbox to find a check from Granddaddy with a note that read, "Don't tell your mama." Over time, the conversations grew shorter, and the calls became less frequent. I settled into my life, and he got over not having a shadow to follow him around anymore. The last time we spoke was on his 90th birthday. That was in September. I'd sung happy birthday to him and asked if he'd gotten his card, and he bragged about it being the best birthday card he ever got, like he always did. We talked about my latest bartending job, and he mentioned that Dooley's was looking for a bartender if I ever wanted to move back. "The fish are biting," he said in that slow country boy voice of his. "Old Ted Cassidy isn't quite the fishing partner you are." "I haven't fished since I left home, Granddaddy," I told him. "Well, that's a shame," was his quiet reply. With an awkwardness I couldn't quite explain, I said, "Well, I got to get ready for work. It's Saturday and the place will be busy tonight." And then I told him I loved him, and he returned the sentiment. I suppose knowing that the last words he heard me say were, "I love you, Granddaddy," should have been a comfort, but instead I was beating myself up for not calling him at Christmas. I blamed my ex for that. We were at a stage right before a breaking up when every conversation was an argument. I should have recognized the signs of a man who had moved on, but I was naive. A couple of weeks later, when I discovered the real reason for all the fighting, I hated him. Now I hated him even more. Had I not been preoccupied with that relationship, I would have had one more conversation with Granddaddy. I finished my supper and went up to my old room, and I crawled into bed and I wiped the tears on my pillow, and I fell asleep. We spent the next 2 days making arrangements, and as we ran around to the funeral home, the cemetery, and the florist shop, the house filled with well-meaning relatives, friends, and neighbors. The kitchen table overflowed with cakes and pies and casseroles lined the counters. Mom was forced into a continuous repetition of how she had gone over to check on her father when he didn't come over for breakfast that morning. She'd found him lying face down on the living room floor. His rifle was lying beside him. At first, she thought he'd killed himself, but there was no blood or any bullet holes. The coroner suggested that perhaps he'd taken his gun out to clean it and was returning it to the safe when his heart gave out. No one questioned that theory, After all, the man was 90 years old. He was taken to the morgue and the gun was placed back inside the safe. It was a nice funeral. Isn't that what everyone says? He looked so natural. Another meaningless platitude. How on earth could anyone ever think a man lying flat on his back inside a velvet-lined black metal case draped in roses and lilies could be in his element? I will never know. He will be missed. That was one I couldn't argue. The dinner afterwards, like all funerals in our family, was filled with laughter and stories of a young Barton O'Connor, followed by more tales of an older man that I knew. Again and again, people talked about the tall tales he used to invent. No one could spin a yarn like Barty. His sense of humor and wit were sharp and mildly self-deprecating. He loved a good laugh almost as much as he loved a good scare. More than one local hunter confessed that his stories about the woods surrounding our farm kept them from wandering onto our property in search of the elusive trophy buck. And others agreed that Granddaddy had them all convinced that this land was haunted by demons and spirits or inhabited by monsters. Someone pointed out Granddaddy's genius in keeping his hunting spot to himself. It was the same with the river that meandered through the far western pasture on Granddaddy's side of the road. We all fished his favorite spots with him at one time or another, but not one person could remember a time when they felt brave enough to wander out there alone. Again, it was a testament to Granddaddy's genius. By Monday night, I was emotionally and physically exhausted. Enough of our relatives had followed us home to prevent the possibility of finding a comfortable seat anywhere in the downstairs. I went up to bed, but the noise of more memories shared from a half a dozen conversations below me permeated my room to the point that I gave up and wandered back down. "Are you okay, dear?" Mom asked me when she saw me slinking down the stairs. I nodded mutely. Correctly judging my lost expression, she came over and whispered into my ear, "If you really want to escape and you're not uncomfortable with the idea, your grandfather's house is empty. You can go over there and have the whole place to yourself tonight." I must have given her a startled look because she quickly added, "Of course, if it bothers you—" "No," I said a little louder than I meant to. "I think that's exactly what I need." Well then," she said with a smile. "Why don't you go up and grab your bag and slip down the back stairs and out the back door?" She didn't have to tell me twice. Nobody locked their doors back then, even if they were never coming home again. I stepped through the door into the living room and flipped on the overhead light. It smelled of cleaning solutions and burnt coffee grounds, a trick used to remove the offensive smell of death from an enclosed space. Mom, in her eternal frugality, had apparently reduced the heat inside the house to a mere 60 degrees. My first act was to rectify that because I was in no mood to build a fire in the Ben Franklin stove in the corner. There was a dark stain on the rug that covered most of the floor that was suspiciously human-shaped. I assumed that Mom, no matter how hard she tried, was unable to remove the last remaining evidence of Granddaddy's occupation. I should have been repulsed. At the very least, it should have sent a chill down my spine. It didn't. I went over to the worn brown leather sofa, and I sat down. A second later, I laid my head down. "Good night, Granddaddy," I said, and moments later, I was sleeping. A long, baleful howl shattered my dreams and sent me into a bolt-upright position. And for a minute, I was confused by my surroundings. I wasn't in my little St. Louis apartment, nor was I in my big comfortable bed over my parents' kitchen. The curtain moving gently and the flowing of the heat from the vent directly below it drew my attention, and I was instantly aware of my location. My eye shot down to the blot on the carpet. "What was that?" I asked the stain on the floor. I didn't expect it to answer. If it had answered, I probably would have had another stain on the sofa to clean, but somehow it felt comforting to know that Granddaddy, however ethereal, was there with me. I was debating the possibility of looking out the window when another howl, this one closer and strangely menacing, echoed through the house. I haven't been back home in years, so I can't attest to the situation today, but back then wolves were considered extinct in that part of the country. Yet that was the closest creature I could think of that could howl like that, and if it was a wolf, it must have been a massive one. I had just determined to walk over and look out the window when something hit the side of the house with enough force to shake the furniture. My next thought was to arm myself. Granddaddy's gun safe was standing on the short piece of wall that framed the wide opening between the living room and the dining room, and I jumped cat-like from the sofa to the middle of the floor, and again, ignoring the fact that I had landed on my grandfather, I made another long leap to the safe. It was no surprise to find it open. Granddaddy never locked it, and whoever had replaced the rifle hadn't bothered to do so either. I grabbed the .243 Winchester and a handful of bullets from the box on the shelf. To my shock, when I broke down the gun to load it, there was already a bullet inside. Never in my life had I known my grandfather to leave a bullet in a gun, safety or no safety. When he put a gun away, it was empty. At the window, I gently slid the curtain aside so I could see out. The sky had paled enough to extinguish the dimmer stars, but not to the point of allowing a detailed vision. The security light that stood between the house and the barn helped a little, but it was old and didn't give off as much light as I would have preferred. Something moved between the barn and the equipment shed. I was sure it was a person. No animal would walk on two legs. I wished it had been an animal. For all their ferocity, animals don't strike the kind of fear in my heart that people do. If it had been a wolf and I had shot it, I might have faced a fine, but not a murder charge. That gives the advantage to the criminal. I'd probably get off on self-defense, but only after an extensive investigation and a lot of undue press. If I was faced with the need to pull the trigger on a human being, no matter how much danger I felt myself to be in, I had better be damn certain it was worth knowing I'd taken a life and putting myself and my family through the inevitable circus and possibly spending the rest of my life in prison. These were the thoughts that drove me to the telephone. I picked it up and called my mom. 5 minutes later, Dad was running across the road with his rifle, ready to do battle. And as soon as I saw him, I stepped out onto the porch. I was pointing toward the equipment shed when he reached the house. He turned and headed in that direction. I ignored his hand signal to stay where I was, and I jumped down off the porch to follow. He stopped short of a little lane that separated the two buildings and glanced over his shoulder. After pinning me with a look of exasperation and following it with a look of resignation, he motioned for me to head over to the other end of the shed while he began a slow, silent, step-pause walk toward the backside of the buildings. My eyes scanned the small, fenced-in pasture as I moved as quickly and as silently as I could get to the back of the shed at the other end. Everything else was still. Dad was already coming around the far corner when I peeked around. We shrugged our shoulders. Neither of us saw a thing. I took one more long look at the tree line on the opposite side of the pasture, and I shivered at the feeling of being watched. The look on Dad's face told me that he felt the same. After a few minutes, he turned and walked back to the house. "Are you sure it was a person?" he asked me. "Did you hear those howls earlier?" I asked in reply. "What howls?" he asked. I couldn't believe he didn't hear them. Neither our house nor Granddaddy sat especially close to the road, but they were no more than 300 yards apart. Those howls were loud, and he would have already been out in the morning milking cows when I heard them. Rather than answer, I said, "It was a person. They were upright." Well, come on then, he said. Mom's got breakfast cooking. Get your stuff and come back over to the house. The sheriff stopped by later that morning at Dad's request. He and Dad walked around the barn and the equipment shed and then wandered around out in the pasture and along the tree line. They didn't find anything. No footprints, no piece of evidence the culprit may have dropped, and no proof that I had seen anything. Dad told him about the house that I had heard, but that he hadn't, and together they decided it was all a bad dream on my part, brought on by the sorrow of my grandfather's loss and the long drive home and the exhaustion of planning and executing a funeral. Well, I was hurt. Granddaddy would have never dismissed my story like that, but there was no point in arguing, so I let it go. Every day at noon, Dad came in for lunch. Mom switched on the little television that was wedged into the corner of the counter, and they quietly watched the news while they ate. This had been their routine my entire life. Well, today I joined them at their meal, and they surprised me with a piece of cake. It was a piece of cake someone had brought for the funeral, and it had a candle in it. "Happy late birthday," Mom said. "You thought we forgot, didn't you?" "Well, no," I lied, but it wasn't like it was the most important item on the list. There was a group chuckle and an awkward silence. Dad lit a candle and they sang happy birthday to me. I dutifully blew out the candle and I thanked them. Dad pulled a card out of his shirt pocket and he tossed it across the table at me. "It's the best we could do," he said apologetically. "Dad, I didn't know what to say. Honestly, didn't expect anything, so a card was more than I could have hoped for. When I opened it, I got the surprise of a lifetime. Enclosed was a check for $1,000. "We know you're struggling and losing your job and all," Mom started, but trailed off when she realized how close she was to venturing into the land of judgment. "It'll help pay a few bills till you get back on your feet," Dad explained on Mom's behalf. "And since it's your birthday, it's a gift." He held up his hand at my attempt to protest. "It's a gift," he reiterated. "You won't have to pay it back, okay?" I was more than grateful at that moment. I was overwhelmed. The thanks I uttered didn't begin to cover it. "I'm going over to Granddaddy's house in a bit," Mom said. "Do you want to come over with me? Help go through a few things?" I nodded my head behind a sardonic smile. That was my eternally pragmatic mother. No time to grieve, no need for melancholy, no point in extravagant displays of emotion. Do what has to be done in a timely manner and to the best of your abilities. And above all, keep right on marching to the beat of the clock until your own grave opens up and swallows you whole. But first, dishes. We crossed the road to Granddaddy's house against a biting wind. What had the weatherman said? I was too busy blowing out my birthday candle to pay much attention. I concentrated, trying to remember. The storm they'd been calling for since Friday had stalled over western Kansas, I think he said. It would be another day or two before it hit us. I should have been packing my bag and hurrying back to St. Louis before it hit. But maneuvering the Scout through a heavy snowstorm wasn't going to be easy. I couldn't stay until it passed, but I'd still be driving on snowpack and ice-covered roads with nearly bald tires. At least I have the money now to buy Scout a new set, I thought to myself. Maybe I'll go in tomorrow and get her some. Mom flashed a scolding look at me when we got inside Granddaddy's house. It was nice and warm because I had forgotten to turn the heat back down. "Sorry," I muttered. "Well, at least we'll have a nice warm workspace," Mom said, as she walked over and dropped the dial on the thermostat a good 5 degrees. "For a little while," I grumbled. "What's that?" "Nothing, Mom." Granddaddy's house was unique in that it was a floor plan of a cabin, but with none of the beauty of exposed beams and weathered timber. The entire house consisted of a living room, dining area and kitchen, 2 bedrooms and a bathroom on the main floor with a loft overhead. We headed up to the loft. It was Granddaddy's office. An oversized, elaborately carved writing desk dominated the middle of the room and looked out of the big picture window on the farm. Matching wooden cabinets, each with a dozen drawers and a pair of doors behind which were a half a dozen cubby holes, sat on each side of it. There was an old velvet upholstered Queen Anne-style settee along the railing that bordered the stairs, and in the corner was a leather recliner that matched the sofa downstairs. When Granny died, Granddaddy built this house and moved in, leaving the massive farmhouse across the road for my mom and dad to move into with their brood of children. My siblings remembered a time when Granny and Granddaddy lived in the farmhouse, but for me, this was the only world Granddaddy ever occupied. I walked over and sat down at the executive chair and I began opening drawers. It was the usual selection of bills, invoices, magazines, and letters. My dad had long ago taken over the running of the farm operation. Granddaddy still dabbled here and there, but none of the paperwork was important enough to bother keeping. Along one wall of the room there were a half a dozen filing cabinets. Unlike the rest of the furniture, they were metal and cheaply made. I walked over and slid open the top drawer of the first cabinet. Folders containing old documents and tax forms intermingled with large envelopes containing photographs. Well, I sighed. This is going to take a while. At 4 o'clock, Mom said that she needed to get home and start supper. "Do you want to stay and keep working?" she asked, hopefully. I glanced down at the piles of folders and envelopes in front of me. I'd managed to go through the first 2 cabinets that afternoon, pulling out what I thought should be taken over to the house immediately, and leaving that which could wait. Photographs were my top priority. "Maybe just a little longer," I said, "at least until I finish this cabinet." I closed the drawer I was working on and slid open the bottom drawer. "All right then," Mom said. "Come back over at 5 and I'll have supper ready for you." I nodded my assent without looking up. I was staring down into a drawer full of hardcover notebooks. The first one was wedged in so tight that I was afraid I'd damage it before I got it out. I had to pull it up one side and then the other and jiggle it back and forth, but eventually it gave way. The cover was scuffed and damaged from wear. The letters DM were written with what looked like a felt-tipped pen in the bottom right-hand corner. The spine gave an arthritic groan as I opened it to see Granddaddy's bold, meticulous handwriting on the yellow, stained pages. January 17, 1956. I heard them howling again last night. I asked Lally this morning if she'd heard anything, but she said no. I think I might get a telescope, one of those spy scopes like sea captains use, and put it up in the attic. The west window should give me a clear view of the woods along the river. I'm pretty sure that's where they're living. I can go up there at night after Lally goes to bed and watch for them. "Shadow!" I nearly jumped out of my skin at the sound of my father's voice calling me from the bottom of the stairs. "Yeah," I said. "I've come over to take you home. Now come on down." Well, confused, I stood up and walked over to the railing. Dad was standing at the bottom of the stairs staring up at me with an angry expression on his face. He glanced accusingly at the book in my hand, and then, in a fraction of a second, the look disappeared. I stared back at him for a moment before he said, "You've done enough work for one day. Your mother's getting supper ready. You need to go help her. You can finish this work later. Now there's nothing here so important that it can't wait." His excuses and explanations were coming at me so fast that there was no time to reply. Well, finally, when he paused for a breath, I said, "But Dad, it won't be dark for another—" "Don't argue with me!" I was so shocked by the tone of his voice that I didn't bother to go back and replace the book or close the drawer. I walked down the stairs and followed him out the door. It wasn't until I got home that I realized I was still carrying the book. I took it up to my room. There wasn't much to making supper that night. people had brought enough to feed us for a month. Mom had already put some of it in the freezer and was busy dividing some of it into Cool Whip and margarine bowls to send home with my siblings when I came in. "The food's warming in the oven. It's Italian," she told me. "I think there's some frozen Italian bread in the freezer on the porch. Can you go grab 2 loaves for me?" I went out to the screened-in porch where a standing deep freeze stood next to a chest freezer. I was busy rummaging through the first one when I got the distinct feeling that I was being watched again. I spun around and stared into the woods that edged our backyard. It was too dark to see anything inside the tree line, but I swore I heard something snort. "Stupid city girl," I chided myself. "It's just a cow." Ours was a dairy farm. Cattle chuff and snort all the time. "You're being ridiculous," I said out loud as I turned and continued to look for the elusive bread. A branch breaking behind me spun me back around. It happened so fast that I wasn't sure what I saw, and all these years later, I still can't say for certain. It was a large black silhouette with a pair of red eyes, or it was a place in the trees that looked like a silhouette before the wind moved a branch and obliterated it. And the eyes? Well, maybe they were from a reflection off of something. I turned around and found the bread, and I went back in the house. "What's with Dad?" I asked as I sat the loaf on the counter. "Oh, you know your father. He's always overly protective," she answered dismissively. "Protective of what?" I demanded. "I'm a grown woman, Mom." Despite the confidence in my voice when I spoke those words at 23, I didn't feel like a grown woman. Mom recognized the shadow of doubt in my eyes, and she said, "You're our baby, Shadow. You'll never be a grown woman to us. It's the price you pay for being born last." And she patted my cheek as she spoke. "It's not my fault I was born last," I argued with all the petulance of a 5-year-old. Dad came in then and went to the sink to wash his hands. We fell silent in his presence, but he didn't seem to notice. The kitchen door opened again and my oldest nephew walked in. Because I was born so many years after my siblings, Derek was actually a year older than me. He had followed in the family business in that he worked on the farm with my father and brothers, but unlike his father, though, he had not yet purchased his own land, nor did he show signs of ever doing so. Everyone else in the family assumed Derek was waiting for Dad or old Granddaddy to die to receive a piece of the family farm before settling down and starting his own operation. Well, I had my own opinion. Derek spent every Saturday night out at the hideaway on County Road RR, drinking and dancing and looking for a piece of tail to bring back to his mobile home in town. He was enjoying his youth, and he wasn't going to let a little thing like making a living get in his way. "Hey, Shadow," he said with a nod of his head. "I thought you'd be heading back to St. Louis by now." "Were you just out back?" I asked, ignoring his statement. He screwed up his face and he said, "No, why?" "I thought I heard something out there when I went out to the back porch," I told him. "Well, it wasn't me." "Yeah, probably just the wind." It sounded like a good enough excuse, but I knew Derek. He was a practical joker from the word go. There was no doubt in my mind that he was the one out there breaking twigs and snorting like a bull. I wasn't about to let him see that it disturbed me, so I made myself busy opening the Italian bread and putting it on a cookie sheet to bake. By the time Mom had supper on the table, all of my siblings and their spouses showed up, bringing with them the rest of my nieces and nephews. As we sat around the table gorging ourselves on lasagna and baked ziti and a wide assortment of other casseroles and side dishes and pies and cakes, the conversation turned to the division of my grandfather's belongings. After 15 minutes, my mind felt numb. My plate was empty and my belly was full, so I excused myself and I went upstairs. Granddaddy's journal was lying on the bed where I'd left it. I picked it up and reread the opening sentences. In 1956, Mom and Dad were married and had already produced all of my older siblings, but they hadn't moved into the farmhouse yet. They didn't do that until after my grandmother died in 1961. I stared up at the ceiling. It was a big, rambling old farmhouse with a half a dozen small bedrooms on the second floor and a walk-up attic that could have easily made it into another bedroom or even a recreation room if anyone had been so inclined. I used to play up there when I was little. The boxes and trunks, full of old family memorabilia and covered with dust, were an endless source of fascination for me. I remembered the rocking chairs and dressers, settees and side tables, all half draped in old sheets, like ghostly reminders of past generations. I had remembered finding a case with a telescope in it. Excitedly, I had set it up with a plan to sneak back up there that night and watch the moon, but to my great disappointment, it wasn't that kind of telescope. At least, I wasn't able to make it work that way. Instead, I turned it toward the woods and then to the river. Looking through that scope from my attic perch, the river didn't seem so far away, but I knew better. I was probably 11 at the time, and I'd already made many a long walk down there to fish with Granddaddy. The full moon that night brought the silvery waters to life. Movement caught my eye, and I zeroed in on two figures wading in without a stitch on. When they began to turn and splash each other, I recognized them as my youngest older brother and his fiancée. They broke up shortly after that, so she never became his wife. Embarrassed to be watching something I knew shouldn't be, I turned and put the telescope back in its case and forgot about it after that. Well, now I wondered if it was still up there. Voices below me rose and fell in muted tones and bursts of laughter. Mom and Dad would be coming up to bed soon, but there was no telling how long the rest of them would stay downstairs and visit. I doubted anyone would give a second thought to me going up to the attic, but for now I wanted it to be my secret, my last little adventure with Granddaddy. I walked quietly down the long hall that separated the front bedrooms from the back. And 10 feet from the end, the hall jogged around the corner that closed off the attic stairs. The door opened with a long, whining moan. I reached up and flipped on the light switch at the base of the stairs, and the two lights above cast long shadows down onto the steps as I slowly began my climb. Then I suddenly felt like a complete fool when I realized I was narrating this entire event in my head like a Nancy Drew novel. "Stop it," I told myself with a cheeky grin. Upstairs was exactly as I remembered it. Discarded furniture was covered in dusty blankets, and boxes and trunks lined the walls under the eaves or were stacked in the middle of the long room. I walked immediately to the west wall and searched for the case I remembered from my youth. It was there, stuck between the wall studs under the window. I pulled it out and brushed it off. It was a cylindrical case that opened at one end, and the telescope and tripod slid out easily. Age had stiffened the joints that allowed the tripod legs to spread and support the telescope, but I managed to get it set up. It didn't take long to find the river, and like that night, a dozen years earlier, the moon was full and cast a bright glow on the water. I scanned up and down the banks, wondering what it was my grandfather had been looking for 30 years earlier when he'd sat up there in the middle of the night. "Shadow?" My mother's voice drifted up the attic stairs, were far more pleasant than my father's had been at Granddaddy's house. "Yeah, Mom," I called back. "What are you doing up there, honey?" "Oh, just reminiscing," I said with all the melancholy my voice could muster. "Well, if you get anything out, can you remember to put it back? You used to leave that place a mess when you were a kid." "Yeah, Mom, I will." I was grateful that she couldn't see me rolling my eyes. Mom was right. I was always going to be her baby. I looked back through the telescope at the riverbank. Although there was nothing of any real interest there, I had to admit that it was a beautiful scene. It had snowed since Christmas, and there had been a few warm days, so there were only a few patches of white here and there. Time had darkened them to a dull gray during the day, but at night, with the moonlight bouncing off of them, they glistened like new. As I watched, a rabbit shot out of the underbrush and crossed one of the patches at high speed. For a brief second, I chided myself for disturbing it before remembering that I was too far away for it to know I so much as existed, much less to be frightened of my presence. Then, in a moment of suspended reality, it was there, scooping up the writhing rabbit and bringing the poor thing to its mouth, and, "Oh my God," I cried. It froze, lifted its head and sniffed the air, and with deliberate, menacingly gradual control, it turned its gaze to the attic window and locked eyes with me. Red, glowing eyes. I jumped back and slid across the floor, knocking over the telescope in the process. A deep, penetrating fear like nothing I had ever felt before gripped me. My heart beat at my chest like a crazed convict seeking release from a cell. I couldn't catch my breath, and sweat blossomed onto my skin and sent chills through my body. My mind raced through every conceivable scenario that justified the word that kept forming, but nothing made sense. From that moment forward, I doubt anything has ever made sense again. Even as I raised a trembling hand to my mouth to prevent the word from escaping, I said, "Werewolf." "Shadow!" As if my heart hadn't already suffered enough abuse in the last few seconds, hearing my name spoken so sharply from directly behind me sent it into another round of furious palpitations. "Dad!" I said as I scrambled to get up and run into his arms. Uncontrolled sobs shook my frame as he wrapped me in a powerful hug. He stroked my hair and gave me gentle reassurances that it was all going to be okay. I couldn't imagine how anything was ever going to be okay again, but it was a comfort to hear him say it. "Dad, I think I saw a—" "Shh," he said when I couldn't finish my thought. I know. "No, you don't," I tried to argue. "Yes, I do," he answered. And then I understood. He did know. He knew exactly what I had seen. I pulled back and looked into my father's face. His dark eyes stared compassionately into mine while he allowed me to adjust to the reality of what had just happened. 1,000 words passed through my mind, but they all refused to organize themselves into intelligible sentences, choosing instead to dissipate before I could say them. With tears running down my cheeks, I buried my face in his chest, and again I asked, "Did I see a werewolf?" "No, baby, you didn't," he promised. All logic was gone at this point. How could he know what I saw if he thought I didn't see a werewolf? Did he think I saw something else? What else was out there that he thought could scare me so? Clearly, he was lying to me. Maybe he was placating me. Maybe my father was a werewolf too. Or maybe that thing out there dining on a rabbit was my grandfather. Granddaddy always did like fried rabbit, but that thing was eating the rabbit raw. "Eulalie," I heard my father speak my given name through a haze that made him feel like he was 1,000,000 miles away. I doubt he'd used that name more than a half a dozen times since I was 6 years old. "Now listen to me. What you saw wasn't a werewolf. Not really. Werewolves are mythical creatures that change when the moon is full." I turned my head to look at the window accusingly at the moon. "That thing out there is what they call in Michigan a dogman." I laughed at that. The absurdity of a thing that terrifying being called a dogman was enough to bring me out of my shock. I pulled back from my father then. He led me over to a fragile-looking chair that matched the settee in Granddaddy's office. Yanking off the dusty sheet that covered it, he pressed me down into it. I was momentarily immersed in a dust cloud and I fell into a coughing fit that ended with a sneeze. Not too far from here, they call it the Beast of Bray Road, he continued. Now, I don't know what they're really called, but I can assure you they're not werewolves. It doesn't matter if the moon is full or if it's daylight or dark. They always look like that. They? I said, when it occurred to me that my father was speaking in plural. He paused a moment, considering what to say, and then he shrugged and said, "Yes, they." "Tell me," I said flatly. Understanding my request, Dad began his story. "Years ago, before your grandmother died and they still lived here, your grandfather told me about them. I didn't believe him at first. He was always such a great storyteller, you know. I figured it was another one of his yarns. And then your grandmother got cancer and died, and he decided to build a house across the road and give this house to us. Well, back then it was just one farm. Parker O'Connor Dairies didn't exist. I had my own farm where your brother lives now." "Well, I know all this," I interrupted. "Of course you do," he said. "We moved in here and it wasn't long before I began to hear them howling. That's what you heard last night. I knew immediately that it wasn't something I was familiar with, so I asked Barty. I asked your grandfather what he thought it was. And that's when he showed me his notebooks. I know you were reading one today. I saw you holding it. Now there are things in the woods around this farm, Shadow, things no one should ever have to encounter. My immediate reaction was to take your mother and your siblings and move back into the old farmhouse, but that would have meant telling her. And I knew if she found out what's out there, she would never leave your grandfather here alone. I knew he was never going to leave. This land has been in his family for generations. And that meant that we had to find a way to stay here and keep ourselves safe. Keeping others away was easy. Barty had been doing it for years with all those scary stories he was always telling. But you kids were another story. The boys were the hardest to deal with. Your sisters never ventured out into the woods much, but your brothers loved fishing and hunting. And all the years they were growing up, your grandfather and I were always keeping a close eye on them. Now, it wasn't easy. And then you came along. You weren't like Jenny and Kate. You wandered into the woods when you were 2 years old, and we had a time finding you. I was sure one of those things had got a hold of you, and, well, he let that thought drift away. Well, that was when your grandfather began to devote himself to you. You were always one for attention, so it wasn't all that hard to do. The worst part was when you wanted to go down to the river with him. He was going there looking for signs of their return, but you wouldn't let him go alone. I looked at him quizzically and I asked, "Their return?" "They're not here all the time, Shadow. They tend to show up in the fall and then they're gone by late spring. I don't know where they come from or where they go, but it doesn't matter. When they leave, something else comes." My head was spinning now. Something else? There was something else out there that could make those things leave? "What do you mean, something else?" I asked. "Those, I know the name for. Several, in fact. They're called Bigfoot." "Dad!" I hissed, then uttered a brief, "Oh," when it occurred to me that I had just seen a werewolf and therefore had no right to doubt the existence of Bigfoot. "Yeah," he said, "and that's not all that's out there, but those are the two worst. Although I have to admit the Bigfoot seem to play by the rules. They're almost human in their behavior, so stay out of their territory and don't interrupt a hunting expedition. Announce your presence when you enter the woods if you think they're around, and if you hear tree knocks or get something thrown at you, just walk calmly and deliberately out of the woods." It was all so insane. I felt suddenly exhausted from all the information that was being heaped on me. Convinced I had just stepped through some type of portal into an alternate reality, I held up my hands and I said, "Dad, stop. This is too much." He looked at me sympathetically and thought for a moment, and then he said, "You're right. Come on, let's go to bed. We'll go into town tomorrow and have coffee. We can talk more about it then. Obediently, I followed him down the stairs, feeling as though I was re-entering reality when I stepped onto the hardwood floor of the hall. He took me to my bedroom and tucked me into the bed before turning out the light, whispering a gentle good night and closing the door. Falling asleep proved to be easy. Staying in that state was another matter. As soon as I drifted off, my dreams showed me images of a werewolf chewing on a rabbit that sometimes turned into my grandfather. Other times the werewolf became my grandfather and the rabbit was my mother. Once I dreamt that I was walking through the woods and something began to chase me. I nearly escaped it until it reached out and grabbed my Red Riding Hood and jerked me backwards, and each time I awoke drenched in sweat and trembling. After several attempts, I sat up in bed and stared out the window, hoping and praying for the sun to come up, fearing that it might never do so again. The next morning, Dad was sitting at the kitchen table when I came down. I half hoped that he wouldn't be there. If he was out in the barn doing his normal morning chores, then I could relegate all that happened the night before to nightmares brought on by all that heavy Italian food I'd eaten at dinner. "Your father says you and he are going to spend the day together," Mom said. I detected a mild tone of disapproval in her voice. She likely would have preferred for me to accompany her across the road to go through more of Granddaddy's belongings. "Not the whole day, Deb," Dad said. "We'll be back by noon, and you can have her for the rest of the day to finish your work at your dad's house." Well, Mom sighed and said, "No, don't rush home on my account. Jenny and Kate are coming over. They can help me. We'll leave the office for Shadow, but we can get the bedrooms done anyway." "Deb," Dad said hesitantly, "we still don't know for sure who was lurking around the house the other night. Promise me you won't go over until Jenny and Kate get here, and promise me you'll take a gun with you." When Mom gave a dismissive huff, he added, "Promise me or Shadow and I won't go." If I hadn't seen what I saw the night before, if my dad hadn't told me what he did, hearing him talk about what happened the day before as if it wasn't just a bad dream on my part may have made me smile. But I did see, and he did tell. The thought of my mother wandering across the road alone was like being punched in the gut. It occurred to me that she did exactly that the day my grandfather died. I felt as though I was going to vomit. "Let's go, Shadow," I heard Dad say. I realized he had been saying it for a few seconds, and I shot him a startled glance and then looked pleadingly at my mother. "Shadow," Dad said again. "Honey, what's wrong? You look sick," Mom said. She reached over and put her hand on my forehead. "She's fine, let's go." Dad's voice was beginning to show impatience. I looked back at him with wide, terrified eyes. My hands were visibly trembling. For a few beats of my heart, I was frozen into place. "We can't go anywhere," I thought. "We have to stay here and watch over Mom and my sisters." What was wrong with my father that he couldn't see that? He stared hard back into my eyes and somehow managed to communicate that we had to leave. "I'm fine," I said, turning back to my mother. "We won't be gone long." And something inside me that I didn't know I possessed lifted me to my feet and dragged me out the door. Once we were in the truck, I knew I could speak openly, and I unleashed my anger on my father. "How can you leave Mom at home like that? You know she's going to go over to Granddaddy's all by herself, and even if she waits for Jenny and Kate, how can you let the three of them go over there alone?" And then another thought occurred to me. How could you have let me go over there to stay the night? "That wasn't my doing," he answered sharply. "I never would have let you go over there by yourself, especially after Barty—" He broke off. "Barty what?" I demanded. "After Granddaddy died? Did those things kill him?" I searched my memory. It didn't make sense. The coroner said he died of a heart attack. Mom said she thought he killed himself, but there was no blood. I saw one of those things tear into a rabbit like it was a piece of overripe fruit. If one killed my grandfather, then there definitely would have been blood. How did Granddaddy die? I asked. He wasn't killed by Dogman, if that's what you mean. Not directly, anyway. It wasn't a satisfactory answer, and Dad knew it. So he continued. I think the coroner had it right. I think his heart gave out. Dad stopped as if he were gathering his thoughts, and I waited. He took a deep breath and exhaled. In all the years that we've been dealing with these things, we've never had one approach the house. They've come as far as the barn before. Over the years, we've lost a few chickens and an occasional calf. The dogs that you thought ran away when you were a kid, barn cats and the like, but they never came all the way to the house. Well, the barns are close enough, I interjected. Our barns weren't so close to our house, but Granddaddy's barn and shed were. I pointed that out. Well, that's true, but your Granddaddy never kept live animals in his barn or shed. They never came anywhere near those before. Last fall, all that changed, though. With Bigfoot, it's different. They slap the side of the house and look in your windows. I even had one that was preoccupied with following me around and watching me doing my chores one year. I knew it was there, but I don't think it knew I'd seen it. Now, dogmen are different. They lack the curiosity that creates incidental human interaction with them. Dad, what are you, some kind of expert? I shot, suddenly feeling an unreasonable anger toward all his sudden knowledge. No, he exclaimed. No, I'm not. The closest person I ever knew to being close to an expert on any of these things was your Granddaddy, and even he didn't know much. All either of us knew was what he observed over the years, and what I'm telling you is what I think, and you can take it and do with it whatever you want. And you think it's perfectly acceptable to leave Mom back at the house, knowing full well she's probably already walking over to Granddaddy's right now? I accused. She won't go, he said. How do you know? Does she know about these things? Well, of course not. Do you think she would have let you go over to your grandfather's house alone at night if she did? She doesn't know, but... He was struggling to find the words. Finally, he said, she seems to realize, she has an understanding. I guess you'd say that when I say not to do something, there's a reason. She won't go. We'd come to the end of our gravel road and turned onto the highway, and to the left was Willard Springs, but we turned right. Where are we going? I asked. We're circling back around. I'm taking you down to the river. I fell silent as a million memories of a million drives with my grandfather following this same route flooded my mind. At the next gravel road, we made another right turn, and a mile down, we turned left onto a secondary gravel road that took us over the river. It curved back around and followed the path of the water for half a mile before forking off to the left again and up a hill. We reached the top where an old cemetery stood watch over the valley. They seemed to like cemeteries, Dad said. The road twisted around again, following the ridge back down to the riverbed where we crossed again. At this point, I knew we were on the backside of our farm. All the land from the opposite bank over was O'Connor and Parker land. If we got out and walked, we'd end up at Granddaddy's barnyard. And when Dad turned off the truck and got out, I realized that was exactly what we were about to do. He pulled a rifle case from behind his seat. He unzipped it and removed his .30-30. From his coat pocket, he produced a handful of bullets. He put 7 in the tube and then added 1 more in the chamber. Let's go, he said. The water ran fast in that part of the river, but I knew that we were heading to a spot where rocks jutted up out of the water close enough together that we could cross over without getting our feet wet. At least I hoped we could. I hadn't come prepared. The sky was gray overhead and it hadn't snowed since Christmas, and I was grateful for that. It meant the water level would be low, but I was already beginning to see signs of the impending storm. The air was damp enough to form micro-pellets of sleet. We approached the crossing point, and Dad went first. He easily navigated the rocks, despite their increasing slipperiness. And then he turned and watched as I followed. And I struggled and nearly fell in once, but I got across. We walked along the river on that side for a few 100 yards, and stopping periodically to look at the tracks. Most of them I recognized. Rabbits and raccoons and possums, a set of coyote tracks, and a groundhog had all visited the river recently. There were other tracks that I didn't recognize. They looked canine, but there was something different about them. For one thing, they were huge. If they belonged to a dog, I couldn't imagine how big it had to be. Actually, I could. My mind went back to the attic and the rabbit being scooped up by the creature that was absolutely big enough to make those tracks. Last fall, they started coming up to the house, Dad told me as we walked. He was speaking quieter now, and with the wind blowing, I had trouble understanding him. I had to concentrate hard on his words. They'd never done that before. They've come to the barn to take livestock, but... Well, you already said that, I interrupted impatiently. Yeah. Well, last fall they started coming to the house. Not all the way up to it, but definitely to the house yard. You saw one around the barn. I stopped dead in my tracks. Dad stopped too and turned and asked me what was wrong. I seriously felt as though I might faint. Now, I've never fainted in my life, but at that moment, that was exactly what I thought I was going to do. Dad, I said quietly, I didn't just see one in the barnyard, and I didn't just hear one howl. We locked eyes, and I said, something hit the house that night. Confusion played across his face. Now, I've since come to understand that my father had never considered a house slap, as he called it, to being anything but Bigfoot behavior. He stood there for a moment and then started walking again. I had to hurry to catch up with him. Well, your grandfather said he was seeing them around the house, but he never said anything about slapping to me. He got into the habit of going out onto his porch and firing his rifle 2 or 3 times at night. It seemed to keep him away. I think, judging by where they found his body the night he died, that he had gone to the door to fire his gun, and when he opened it, there was one on the porch. He slammed the door shut, and well, I think the shock of seeing one so close caused him to have a heart attack. Dad, you don't know that, I retorted. Well, yes I do, he answered. I saw your mother come running out of the house, and I knew something was wrong. We met in the middle of the road, and she said that he was dead. She went on to the house to call 911, and I went on over to your grandfather's. There were tracks all around. It's been warm here these last couple of weeks, and the ground's pretty soft. I see. I didn't know what else to say. We were working our way back up to Granddaddy's house. It was a path that I could walk in my sleep if I had to. The snow was starting to come down a little harder now. I was wishing I had on a pair of Carhartts instead of the fancy winter dress coat I'd brought for the funeral when Dad put his hand on my arm to stop me. I looked at him and he placed his finger against his mouth to indicate silence. We listened. I didn't hear anything, and apparently neither did he, so we started walking again. But this time I heard it too. Our path divided an open grass meadow from a patch of woods. Something was definitely moving inside the trees. We stood and listened for a moment. Nothing moved, so we continued. Another 15 steps, and we both stopped at the sound of footsteps. Dad motioned for us to keep walking. We were halfway between his truck and Granddaddy's house, and at this point, our direction didn't matter. I found myself staring wide-eyed into the dark recesses of the underbrush and saplings, waiting for something monstrous to suddenly appear and run out of the woods and attack us both. Dad had fallen slightly behind me as if to watch my back. I wanted him next to me with one arm around me to protect me. I reasoned that it would be foolish for him to hold me at that moment. He needed his hands free to fire his weapon if he needed to. 15 more steps, and our world shook with an earth-shattering howl. Not from our right, where the woods were, but from the grass meadow to the left. We stopped dead and looked at each other for a single moment. "Go," Dad said. I responded by stepping up my pace and walking, but not running, as fast as I could to get to my grandfather's house. On both sides of me now I heard the sounds of footsteps. Blades of grass cracked to my left, while twigs and branches crunched to my right. "They're pack animals," I heard my mind say. "Wolves are pack animals." We were being hunted. I wanted to say that to my father behind me, but I couldn't find the necessary air to form the words. My lungs were already struggling to gather enough oxygen to keep me in motion. 1/4 of a mile, I guessed. I was 1/4 of a mile from my granddaddy's house. The long grass to my left waved and arched, but I didn't know if it was the weight of some horrible monster or the increasing wind that was now carrying enough snow on it to limit my vision. I was grateful that Dad was behind me with his gun. No matter what, if we had a gun, I felt like we had the advantage. 200 yards, I told myself. If we can get to Granddaddy's house, we'll be safe inside. We can lock the doors. We can barricade ourselves in. We can use the phone and call for help. "We'll be all right in a minute, Dad," I called over my shoulder. I heard the pounding of his footsteps in answer. Another 100 yards and we'd be safe. I could see the barn and the shed. There was the porch of the house. We were almost there. Another 50 yards. We were going to be okay. "Keep up, Dad," I yelled. "We'll make it." I could hear his heavy breathing behind me. I entered the barnyard and broke into a dead run. I took the stairs of the porch in 2 steps and threw open the front door and turned to let my father in behind me. He wasn't there. A cold, empty silence filled the world. Snow was coming down in twisted angles on angry bursts of wind, but I heard nothing. It's funny how the world turns gray in the dead of winter. Insanely, I remembered that it was February 3rd, truly the dead of winter. The sound of a gunshot somewhere between me and the river brought me back to my senses. He wasn't with me, but he was still alive. I couldn't fathom why he hadn't come with me. Was he drawing them off of me? Had he instinctively run back to his truck while I had chosen the safety of my grandfather? There was no time to think of that now. I had to get to my dad. I flew back down the porch stairs and across the road. Scout was sitting right where I'd left her 5 days earlier. I hadn't even tried to start her in all that time. I carried my keys in my pocket at all times, and for that I was grateful. Her door squealed as I opened it and slid into the driver's seat, and my hands shook as I fumbled to put the keys in the ignition. With the temperament of an old man screaming at the neighbor's kids to get off his lawn, she whined to life. "Oh, thank you, Jesus," I cried as I threw her into gear and nearly went airborne crossing the road into my grandfather's barnyard. The path I'd run to get to his house was barely wide enough to drive Scout down, but I didn't care. In a few places I found myself mowing through the grass, but it didn't matter. As the trail turned and ran alongside the river, something stood up in the grass and glared malevolently at me. It had the head of a wolf, and eyes that appeared to glow from some inner source, and a mouth full of lethal-looking teeth. I was so busy staring at that thing that I didn't see the other one on my left until it slammed its body into Scout's side. The first one burst into action as they both began to run alongside us as if to herd us along. Well, I knew I couldn't cross the river in Scout where we'd crossed earlier. There was a place a little further down where the bottom was rocky, but it meant driving into the water that might be a foot deep or more. I had no choice. I had to find my father. 2 more shots rang out as I approached the crossing point. It was my dad. He was firing at the 2 dogmen who were attacking me. Relief was immediately replaced by panic as I saw a third come out of the woods and head straight for him. I gunned the engine and managed to get between them in the nick of time. Dad wrenched open the door and jumped in. "Where did you go?" I screamed at him. "I had to draw them away from you," he yelled back. "Now go, go, go." I pushed Scout's accelerator to the floor as we hit the water. The snow was coming down at a blinding rate now. "Get to my truck. We'll take it back," Dad yelled. "The hell we will. I'm not stopping," I exclaimed. We got out onto the road and Scout's rear end fishtailed behind us. I thought for a second about her ball tires, but it was too late now. I'd chosen my path and we had to follow it. And by the time we got to the primary gravel road, I felt comfortable enough to slow down a little. Nerves and fear kept me from going too slow, but Scout's tires wouldn't let me go any faster. The main highway was covered in snow, but we managed to crawl along to our gravel road, and as we pulled into the barnyard, Scout heaved a sigh and died. I loved that old truck. She was ugly as hell, but she was mine. Mom and Dad decided that I should inherit Granddaddy's truck. I couldn't have been happier. It was only a couple of years old and had about as many miles as a 90-year-old man who never went any further than the local cafe for a cup of coffee could put on it. It was an ugly moss green, but I didn't care. It was mine. Dad made me promise to never tell Mom what had happened. Our official story was that he had gotten stuck in the water and I'd tried to pull us out with Scout. It was too much for the old girl and she gave out. There was a long argument out in the hay barn where no one could hear us, during which I insisted they sell that farm and move away from there. Dad refused to entertain the possibility, and I had to accept that they were never going to leave that place. In the end, he assured me that it was all going to be okay. He would always be there to protect Mom and my brothers and sisters and nieces and nephews. Because I wanted to believe him, I accepted his word as law. I drove away that cold February morning, and except to come home when first Mom and then he died, I never went back again. I know I'm a coward. Like most people who discover that monsters are real, I've made it my mission to learn as much about these things as I can. But I do it through books and, these days, the internet. I don't go out in the woods because I never want to feel hunted again.